Hello everyone, my name is Jason Ferguson. I'm one of the 3D faculty here at EMU. We're in interesting territory here. We don't really quite know how to adapt to the situation. So to begin, we decided as a 3D faculty that it might be beneficial for our students to see our process and our approach to making 3D work. We each come from different backgrounds and we approach 3D sculptural objects in different ways. So we thought we'd start by just sharing what we do. So, as I mentioned, my name is Jason Ferguson. I started here at EMU in 2010. I teach 3D design, sculpture. I teach advanced portfolio classes as well as digital fabrication. I received my BFA in Baltimore, and then I got my MFA in 2006 from the University of Delaware. Over the last 15 years or so, I've created a collection of absurdist and sometimes humorous performance pieces, videos, and sculptural objects. The results are pretty diverse. And in thinking about this work, I've noticed that there are themes that I tend to carry throughout my practice. So this idea of layers and strata, both building up in layers and cutting back down through layers through deconstruction. Circles and cycles come up again and again, both aesthetically, circular imagery, and then also cyclical videos that don't have a start or an end. The idea of replication and manipulation comes up again and again. I tend to work with found objects and manipulate and recontextualize them. And then most importantly, the idea of process over product. I'm much more interested in the process, and a lot of times my works are conceptually kind of driven by the process itself, not the resulting artifact. As I mentioned, I tend to work with objects or circumstances that already have an established meaning, and then I physically and contextually manipulate those situations to generate new experiences. So, for example, in 2008, I was invited to participate in an artist residency in Koderfijn, the Netherlands. And the train ride from Amsterdam to Koderfijn was interesting. I'd never been to Europe before, and it was this sort of gridded landscape where you'd see these sort of rectangular parcels of land surrounded by a moat filled with water, and then an electric fence and small collections of cattle on each piece of land. So when I got to the residency, I decided to kind of borrow these individual pieces of the Dutch landscape and create a site-specific installation using just one cow, one small island that I created by hand digging an actual island, filling the moat with water, and a singular electric fence. And a lot of people asked me about the well-being of the cow. I took care of her for the entire residency. And in the Netherlands, part of my research, I found that you only have to have enough room for the cow to lunge forward and stand. So there were hundreds of cattle just kept in these little stalls that were super dirty and unkept, and it wasn't very nice. So this cow got a sort of a little vacation. She had her own piece of land outside, and I took care of her directly. I've also played around with manipulating cyberspace and making it physical. So this piece is called WikiGod from 2010, or Google Searching for God. I used the #1 rated search engine and basically transcribed the hypertext behind Wikipedia's definition of God, which ends up, when it's made physical, ends up being about a 40-foot scroll. So I used a typewriter without ink, slammed the keys very hard, and that embossed the paper. And then whenever the word God appeared in the code, it was illuminated from below. And then I made this custom table to display the piece that lit up the images and the text from below. Most commonly, I physically change objects to recontextualize them. In 2013, I was given 2 rooms at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Detroit and kind of given free rein on what I wanted to do in that space. So in the first space, I actually built a room within the room. I built a dining room that was about 20 feet by 16 feet. And it had a custom hardwood flooring with this circle cut out of the floor. And then I made this dinette set that had been transformed into a carnival ride using I found dinette set and a trailer that was hand built and then coated in the hardwood flooring, about 200 Cabicon Carnival lights, and a chaser circuit to make the lights flash in pattern. This is just a few process images. So we've got the trailer at the top that was manipulated, all the lumber, and then I started out with a small model and some CAD drawings, and then fabricated the work from scratch in wood, hardwood, oak flooring, welded steel, and electrical. Here's a small video of the piece installed. It also had an audio component that was coming from within the carnival ride. The other piece that I showed at MoCAD was in another smaller space, kind of a narrow corridor of a room. So I made a 25-foot steel carnival sign that said "Home Sweet Home," sort of this very familiar, ubiquitous phrase, and then combining that with a light pattern that was pretty uncomfortable. It was very fast and erratic, and took this, what was supposed to be somewhat comfortable language, and made it quite uncomfortable. So here's a short video of that one and how it worked. So all these sort of manipulated found objects led to an artist in residency, or I was an artist in residence at a art residency called Elsewhere Artist Collaborative in Greensboro, North Carolina. And I could do an entire talk on this residency. I'll make it kind of quick. So in summary, this is Sylvia Gray. She and her husband, Joe, ran this 4-story historic building as sort of an Army surplus and thrift store. Joe passed away, and she began to hoard objects and develop dementia. So when she passed, her grandson, this is George Shear, took over the space and didn't really know what to do with it. So he started, he basically created an artist residency and invited artists first from the local community to come over and move things around to try to change the space and organize what was there. The crew involved Steph Sherman. She was the co-director. Jay Gamble was the director of fabrication. So he basically helped artists in residence with their fabrication needs. And it was an immersive space. It was 4 stories just filled with stuff. So the first group of artists just moved things around based on color. So this would be winter. So they took all of the white or off-white items from the entire building and put them in one location. They had a spring section that was all the colorful pieces. And then the residency started to grow pretty rapidly. And when I was there, there was a cohort of artists that were from all over the world. So these are some of the artists in residence when I was there in 2000, I want to say 6 or 7. So Monique Beston was a photographer and performance artist from the Netherlands. Mary Roethlisberger was an archivist from Virginia. She created the Bureau of Public Recollection, which is a online archive of individual memories. So you could log on to her site and donate memories, and they would be logged and kept forever in this archive. Yuko Takamura was an animator from Japan. Lisa Lipton was a composer and installation artist from Nova Scotia. And what most people did was that they came into the space, they looked at all the materials that were available to them throughout the building, and then they would kind of clear out a location and make a site-specific installation with what they found. A few examples of some of the installations in the space. Other artists did performance pieces. So this is a short video. It's a video still from Monique Beston's performance where she wore a dress that she found in the space and then methodically cut out the pattern. So you can see the flowers are being removed with this little pair of scissors there and slowly kind of revealing her body below. These are just some of the flowers that had been removed and the scissors she was using. I was most interested in the history of the building and the way that materials and memories sort of stacked over time. I was thinking about it as sort of the strata of the building's history. So materials on top, in theory, would be the most recent, and the materials buried down below would be older. I know that's not exactly how it worked, but it made me think about ways to approach the space. So I decided to do a geological core sample of the entire building and all the objects in the way. So from the first floor, you can see there's this shelf with a bunch of Monopoly games and this box here that had a duck decoy in it. There was a mannequin on top, and then this is the hole going up to the second floor. This light on the ground here is coming from 4 stories up. That was not anticipated, but the 12-inch diameter core went through the entire building and anything in the way. So when it went through the roof, it allowed the sunlight to come down all the way through the 4 stories to the bottom floor on the ground. And this is Jay Gamble looking up through the core, and this is what he would be seeing. And this little moment right here is one of my favorite parts. That was unanticipated because I started actually in the middle and went up and then plumb bobbed down to make sure the core was straight all the way through. And it just happened to go through and cut Waldo in half here on the bottom of this shelf. So more recently, and sort of peppered throughout my practice, actually throughout the years, there's this kind of recurrence of using scientific protocol as a way to explore my tangible existence, sort of an existential investigation. And I've done this in a few different ways. First, I've explored the physical objects and spaces around me. So to look at a few of these projects directly, this is a short clip from the Visible Human Project in 1994, at the University of Maryland in College Park. The first subject was a convict that donated his body to science, and he was frozen in a block of dry ice, and then he was milled from head to toe, and each very thin layer that was milled away was photographed. And what I was thinking about here was that his body was physically destroyed, right? He no longer has physical existence. He only exists through this sort of time-lapse video passing through every layer of his body down through the floor. So I thought that it'd be interesting and sort of absurd to try to do the same process with the objects around me, and maybe that would have some sort of validity and give me some insight into my own existence. So I made the visible lamp project first. So this is the start of a very rudimentary, basically MRI machine that would destroy the lamp and give me photographs of each layer. It evolved to this, and each one of these sections has purpose. So from the side here, these 2 sections were to support the lamp, carrying it horizontally through space. This front section had a special light kit, so it had light at the 4 corners that would illuminate the object. And this is the sled that carried the lamp. And the sled was attached to a worm gear that 1.5 turns would bring the entire lamp and the sled forward 1/8 of an inch. And then here's the light box I was mentioning. So there's lights in the 4 corners here going towards the center. There's a thin layer that's been removed so that when the lights are off and the light box is turned on, it just illuminates this front layer. And these are 3 cheap laser levels that I picked up at Home Depot, and those would allow me to put a very precise line on the surface of the object. So the process was 1.5 turns of the worm gear, carry the lamp 1/8 of an inch forward into the lasers. I would use a collection of different cutters and grinders to take off that very thin layer. Then the light box was turned on and the lights were turned off, and that layer that was cut would be photographed. Lights would come back on, and I'd start the whole process over again. So just slowly going through this layer by layer. So here's a short video clip of the Visible Lamp project. And in the end, it was about 60 hours of just slicing and photographing each layer not counting design or fabrication of this apparatus or editing the video or anything. Just slicing and photographing is about 60 hours, and the ending video is about 60 seconds long. So I'm sorry, not even 60, 6 seconds long. So 60 hours for 6 seconds of video. Not the biggest turnaround for my efforts, but I was pretty happy with the results. It has this very kind of cellular, kind of undulating video passing through the object. Another example of scientific protocol and process applied to objects is the careful disassembling of the objects to analyze their contents, and again to kind of try to understand what separates the physicality of these objects from my own physicality as a human being. So the first piece that I wanted to do was a post-mortem examination of a La-Z-Boy reclining chair. Before I jumped into the large object, I worked with what I knew and what I had access to. So I did a shoe dissection, and I was able to apply what you would normally learn in a high school biology lesson, maybe a dissection of a fetal pig or a frog, and I applied that to a shoe. I found the results to be quite disturbing and a little bit unnerving, and also kind of had this weird kind of visceral gut reaction to seeing a scalpel pass through any material, especially with care and precision, right? Like that's what makes this strange, is seeing the level of care that I'm taking and basically taking a simple kind of ridiculous object like a shoe apart. So I found that to be quite interesting, and I decided to go ahead with the larger postmortem examination of the La-Z-Boy. This is the result of the shoe dissection, and I often show the video alongside the actual object, but I never show the resulting object alone. I think the process and the actual procedure applied to the shoe is what is important. So the video itself is kind of the embodiment of the idea, I feel. I started doing some research for the autopsy piece. Obviously, I kind of knew dissection from high school, but I did not know autopsy. So I was fortunate enough to work with a pathophysiologist named Dr. Neves. That's him there. And I worked with him for a few months, learned postmortem examination, I didn't learn everything about it, but I worked on human cadavers with Dr. Neves so that when I applied what I learned to the chair, it would be authentic. So here's a very short video clip. The actual procedure was over an hour and a half long or so. This is sort of an edited version. So first we prep the subject, and then we check the glands. And again, there's humor here, I hope, right? It's supposed to be ridiculous. But my feeling is that humor kind of passes back and forth and is balanced by kind of disturbing imagery. And again, like you kind of laugh at it because it's ridiculous, but then it's also a bit disturbing seeing a scalpel pass through anything, and this level of care being applied to a La-Z-Boy starts to make you think, hopefully, about materiality and tangible existence. So this is the typical Y incision that is done shoulder to sternum, and then down the middle to the pelvis. I will say that there was a lot of learning, big learning curve here. I'd never worked on cadavers before, and then even in the autopsy table itself, I really wanted to do this procedure in an actual facility with a real autopsy table, but for some reason I couldn't get anybody to let me have access to their medical facilities to do this postmortem examination of a chair. So I ended up, I found online there's a company called Mortec Industries, and I used, really quickly, this is disemboweling. So there's like this nice sort of gut-like spongy material that was inside of the chair. A side note, like I had two shoes, right? I did one as sort of a dry run. I could kind of understand it better and see how I was going to approach the final one. I only had one La-Z-Boy, so the fact that it had this weird membrane in here and it had this sort of gut-like material, that was all a nice surprise. It could have been really boring and just an empty cavity, but luckily they built these things with layers and a few components that would make it more interesting if I was to kind of carefully take each object apart layer by layer. So back to Mortec Industries. So I found this website that had the schematics and the drawings and dimensions for their autopsy tables because they were trying to promote and sell their product. So as an artist and a sculptor and a problem solver, I used their schematics, their plans, their blueprints, and I just built my own stainless steel autopsy table to perform a procedure in my own studio. So here's the autopsy table with the disemboweled chair and the video projected behind it. There's a close-up of the stainless steel autopsy table. Again, exactly to spec, aside from the fact that it doesn't have running water. The second way that I use scientific protocol as an attempt to kind of understand and define my own existence is through exploring my actual body directly, not the objects around me, but turning it onto myself, sort of the empirical aspects of my physicality. So I've done this superficially through high-definition video scans of every inch of the exterior of my body, turning my existence into this sort of topographical landscape. So the apparatus on the left is a carriage that carries a high-definition video camera 180 degrees around my body, and then I face the wall and I do 180 degrees around the back, and then it's lowered by 1 inch, and I do the same thing over and over again. So they're 10 times optical zoom, very close video scans of the surface of my body, which ends up just being imperfections and hair and sort of a disgusting view. But again, it becomes, because of proximity and the mixed up video, you could be standing right next to me and not realize that it's me in the video. So it's every inch full identity. But through distance and proximity, you couldn't tell that it was me or someone else. Most recently, I've been interested in this sort of volumetric definition of existence. So I've attempted to capture this by recreating the exact volume of space that I occupy as a sort of a boulder out of foam. So I'll talk about that piece a little bit later. And I've also focused on the unique internal architecture of my body and the skeletal system within, and the nature of being, which is on the bottom. So I'll expand on these two projects a little bit. The nature of being is a full-scale replica, 3D printed replica of my entire skeletal system. To create the piece, I had collaborated with the University of Michigan in their research MRI lab, and I had about 8 hours of MRI scans. I drove to Chicago and worked with Northwestern Memorial Hospital and had an EOS scan, which imaged my spine, pelvis, and lower limbs. And I had a CBCT scan of my mandible, actually my teeth and my mandible, the lower jaw, for a really bad root canal I had a few years ago. And then I also had scans of my skull from the sinuses up for migraines. So I was able to kind of piece together all of these different medical scans and medical images of my body. And then the bottom image there is a screen capture of medical software that I learned to segment out the bone from the surrounding tissue. So I was able to segment the bones, generate 3D models from the segmentation process, and then I was able to assemble, I'll show you the clavicle there. I was able to take all the 3D modeled bones from the scans, assemble my entire skeleton digitally, and then disassemble each 3D model, print them separately, and reassemble the full-scale 3D printed version of my skeleton in physical space. I did a second version of this. There's two models of my skeleton, life-size now, floating around the world. One's actually in Philadelphia, and the other one just got back here to my studio. This one's called Baby Blue, so it's the same 3D printed model as the gray one earlier. However, the bones are flocked with this baby blue material, so it's got a really soft texture, and in my mind it was kind of connecting birth to death through this baby blue color that one might have a onesie for their baby when they're born. Be this very soft kind of felt-like velvety material, and usually in this baby blue color. So I flocked the actual memento mori of my skeletal system, tying birth to death directly. Where the 3D printed skeleton replicates my anatomy, being nothing more is an attempt to define existence as a limited amount of physical space. So the piece is a CNC milled rock that occupies the same volume as my body. So first I had to find out how much volume or how much space I occupy. I ended up working with air displacement plethysmography, which is this really weird, it's called a bod pod, which I love, but it looks like sort of this Mork and Mindy sci-fi little pod. And what you do is you get in, and they use it for, nutritionists usually use it working with athletes to track changes in athletics and their bodies, so as body fat index, muscle ratio, all of these things. So I was fortunate enough to say, hey, can that just tell me how much space I occupy? And they were like, well, yeah, we can calculate that pretty easily. So they put in this white metal object back here into the pod first, pressurized it, got a calibration reading, and then I got in and they pressurized it, and they were able to tell me how much space I occupy. So at that day, at age 38, I occupied 5,616.188 cubic inches. I then 3D scanned a rock, just a small rock that was about 6 inches across, scaled it up until it occupied the same 5,616 cubic inch volume, sliced it into 1-inch layers using some CAD software, and then milled each layer, two-sided 3D milled each layer out of foam, coated it in epoxy, and created this boulder. I was fortunate enough to be in Tokyo about a year ago, and I furthered the piece by doing a sort of performance piece where I made a sort of a rucksack to carry this boulder that occupies the same volume as my body around Tokyo. So here's a little video clip me carrying the piece throughout Tokyo. I will read a brief quote as you're watching this video. So this piece and a lot of my other works were inspired by Jean-Paul Sartre. In one part of Being and Nothingness, he writes, the world is human. We can see the very particular position of consciousness. Being is everywhere, opposite me, around me. It weighs down on me, besieges me, and I am perpetually referred from being to being. That table which is there is being and nothing more. That rock, that tree, that landscape, being and nothing else. I want to grasp this being, and I no longer find anything but myself. I'll stop right after. There's this great Justin Bieber jacket that walks by in a second. Then I'll move to the next slide. There he is, Bieber. All right. So I'm going to end with this piece. This is I had a solo show in Detroit a few years ago at a place called Public Pool, and when I was preparing for my show, I was going in and out of this little alley entrance. This is the entrance to the gallery, and I became sort of fascinated with this space. This was how I'd go in and out of the gallery when I was doing my measurements in preparation for the exhibition, and it became such routine that I just wanted to recreate that entire entry again. So I took tons of measurements, tons of photographs, and then I recreated that exact space in my studio. So I'll go back again, and then this is my replica in progress. It's not done here. But the idea was that I would replicate every detail from that entryway, and then I would put my installation directly inside of their actual entryway, so that when you enter the gallery for my show, you turn around and close the door behind you, and you turn around to go in, and you're actually in the same room that you just left. So there's this weird sort of deja vu that happens entering the space. So this is my space inside of the original. So This is the original door. This is my copy, including all markings, tape, dirt, any sort of markings that were on this space. I measured over and down or over and up and coordinated, and then applied the same surface deformations to my door here. You can see that the actual graffiti and staple pattern, everything is repeated inside as well. So this is a little video passing through their space into my gallery. So it's the original door here. You can see the markings in dirt and tape. And this is my copy. Sort of a revisited some earlier work. So this is the carnival sign in a different orientation. So this skull piece, I'll talk about a little bit more after this. I haven't talked about that one yet. So it's an anamorphically distorted skull from my CT scans. So it looks normal, but then when you move around it, it changes pretty drastically. It's sort of an infinite space within a hat, referencing Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett. And the boulders sort of floating and rotating in space, and my skeleton is behind. So really quickly, I'm just going to plug my fall class called Digital Fabrication. So a lot of stuff we've talked about so far. My work is quite large. I do teach digital fabrication, which I started in 2012. I became interested in 3D printing in about 2011, and what I normally do is when I become interested in something, I kind of become obsessed, so I have to learn everything about it. So the first thing I did was use the university's new 3D printer to print components and build my own 3D printer for my studio. And this is still my most reliable printer, almost 10 years later. I got past the idea of 3D printing as being cool and started focusing on this idea of the embodiment of time. So the layers and strata of 3D printing sort of embody time, right? Like it's like the rings of a tree building from the bottom of the print bed all the way up. And some of this research led to my inclusion in the 3D Additivist Cookbook in 2016 or 2015, edited by Morris Aliari and Daniel Rourke. My contribution was 3D printed graffiti called mesh bombing. So I made this sort of ridiculous poster about how to mesh bomb. So you'd first select an object. You'd select an object from a site. So I was working with this weird coffee shop in Ipsy, and I would borrow objects. So you can either borrow them or you can 3D scan them with your phone. But if you 3D scan them on site, people might notice you. So I was borrowing them and then scanning them off site, creating these 3D models, manipulating the models, 3D printing these sort of sculptural 3D printed objects, and then returning the original object with my sculptures back to the site. So the first one I did was just a straight copy. There's a strange little bust sculpture that I scanned and made a replica of and just put the two side by side. There's some process images there. And then I started to play around with form and repetition and some of the elements that you all are learning in 3D design right now. So there's this Ganesh sculpture in the back. So replicated it and repeated it and scaled it to make this sort of pink elephant parade piece, sort of a Disney-esque representation using this Ganesh sculpture. I also borrowed this weird skull. It's like a marble skull. That was just a decorative object in the space, and I Boolean differenced it, so I subtracted it out of a Yoda head, and then I installed the Yoda head and the original skull on site. And the last one I was going to talk about is this collection of zombies. So there was a little zombie rubber like finger puppet that was on a lamp. So I scanned that, and then I made this zombie applicator. So this device allowed me to snap in these zombies so that when I installed them on site, I could walk in with this thing in my bag with the zombies in place, I could push it against the wall, break off the applicator, and then leave this little installation of zombies that were kind of growing out of the wall. And I was able to do that in multiple places. And I got filament that was the same color as the wall paint in the space, so that you had to kind of discover these things. They were sort of subtle. But then once you discovered one set, you'd find that there are about a dozen sets throughout the space. Here are just a few images of the process for the anamorphic skull. So that's looking at it straight on, and then it was elongated by about 3 feet. Here's it in my studio assembly, and here's a short video walking around it. So in digital fabrication in the fall, we'll play with 3D printing, laser cutting, CNC milling, which this loud video here is CNC milling. And this is a 3D form that I milled that was in the faculty show recently. And it's just made out of this pink foam and then coated in epoxy and painted. And then lastly, this 7-foot CNC milled distorted object. It's called Distorted Americana. And it's a sort of a 3D scan from Google Earth of Rushmore that we've distorted and milled out of 3-inch foam. And we left it raw, so it's a pretty fragile object. And then it has these sort of pink map pins and 3D printed elements. Also included these sort of like growths or like tumors that have been 3D printed and added in there as well. So keep an eye out for digital fabrication. The only prerequisites are to have taken Foundations Digital Media and 3D design, which you're in right now. So if it's a project or a subject rather that's interesting to you, reach out to me via email. It's only offered in the fall. And again, we'll cover 3D printing, laser cutting, CNC milling, vacuum forming, and other processes like that. Thank you very much.